You have joined Holding Challenging Conversations Online. This is a webinar brought to you by the State Performance Plan Technical Assistance Project at the Napa County Office of Education. My name is Connie Silva, and I'm the director of SPP-TAP, as we refer to our project. We're funded by the California Department of Education to provide assistance to districts throughout California, all local educational agencies, in addressing disproportionality and issues of equity. So for today's session, we want you to know that all of your audio has been turned off. You will be muted during the session. We do want you to participate, so we want to make sure that you're using chat. You'll see that at your bottom of your screen so that you can let people know, let Bill know what your thoughts are and any questions. And there are times during the session when he will ask you to respond to a prompt. We also are right now, if you're in chatting, if you want to go ahead and use that, you can let us know that you're here. Let us know what district you're with. I'm sure we have many of you that are familiar faces, although we can't see your faces right now. So again, we welcome you. We're expecting a pretty large group today. And you will at times, I should let you know that this is being recorded, as we always do with our webinars. So you will be able to view this archive at a later date, and any of your colleagues that were not able to join us could do that as well. So if they weren't able to be here today, or you want to share later that you viewed this wonderful webinar, you can feel free to share the link that will be eventually on our website after the fact. During the presentation, you will be asked at points to not just chat, but also possibly do some self-reflection and be writing. So if you have a paper and pencil in front of you, if you would like to grab that real quick, you know, it might be helpful to you. Don't feel like you need to have it. If you're in a spot where you don't have it, that's fine. So before we get started, again, just want to welcome everyone. And I'm going to introduce our presenter today, Bill All. Before that I do that, I just wanted to make a note to say that our presentation today, we selected this topic some time ago, knowing that COVID-19 pandemic means that LEAs across the state are needing to move many of their efforts to address disproportionality and improve racial equity into a virtual setting. And that's why we thought that this topic was timely. It turns out that today the need for this webinar is even more evident. The protests against racial injustice that are happening nationally and internationally clearly demonstrate the need for universal need for holding courageous conversations in all forums. So I think that this is, again, very, very relevant to not just your work on disproportionality, but in a broader sense. So very happy that we are here with you today. Our presenter, William All, is here from Spokane, Washington. And let me tell you just a little bit about him before I pass it on to him. So Bill is a facilitator and event designer working with a popular education-based approach to designing and facilitating meetings and events that bring people together on a horizontal level. He brings an intersectional analysis of oppression to the work, always looking at how power differentials can impact the way people participate in public life. And bringing this perspective helps in the design of events that are more inclusive and in which all people can shape the outcomes. Bill has worked with educators and administrators at the primary, secondary, and higher education levels to explore issues of equity, race, and gender justice for the staff, the students, and general communities. He's been working in online collaboration since 1999, creating and supporting collaborative teams for nonprofits and non-governmental organizations across the country and around the globe. So with that, I'll pass it on to Bill. Welcome, Bill, and thank you very much for being here and joining us today.
Thanks, Connie and Susan and all the folks in your organization. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here today. As Connie said, we'll be using chat and self-reflection a lot through this webinar as a way to help bring us into a more interactive space. When you're doing your holding challenging conversations, obviously you'll be in different formats where you can have people working together more closely. But we will see how to navigate this space and promote a a deeper understanding of how we can have those challenging conversations. And as Connie said, the challenging conversations, the need has always been there, but it's ever so obvious, more obvious now in this moment. I live in Spokane, Washington, I think, as Connie said, and it's touched our community deeply. What happened, what's happening across the country, and we're having large-scale protests for this size city that we're having right now. So as we look to promote more understanding and deeper exploration of racial equity in all the different aspects of our school and community life, as Connie said, we need to keep going deeper into our ways of using online tools as well as in-person spaces. So the goals and objectives for today are, we really want to explore the challenges to hosting the online challenging conversations and look especially at power dynamics within stakeholder meetings and the other school meetings that you have. Explore ways to design these meetings and to share some facilitation and outreach tips with you as we go on. And at the end of the session, we'll be doing a little bit of a role play of a challenging meeting online, and 4 members of the community have stepped up to work with us. Hopefully you have a chance to see some of the dynamics that you might see in your meetings play out. So for just a moment, I'd like to ask you to either close your eyes or just stare down gently at your desk or at the floor. Take a couple breaths. If you'd like to reflect with me in this moment, if it feels good, check out how you're doing in your body. How are you feeling in your body? And notice how you're feeling and notice what thoughts are coming in your mind. And in your heart. And just as people are beginning to do, type 3 words into the chat representing how you're doing. And as you're paying attention to the chat, you can see that a lot of us are stressed and feeling overwhelmed and frustrated, tired. At the same time, there's hope and love that's in the space as well. So now as you're in a reflective space, you can keep typing in and take another moment, and this is just a silent reflection. Who do you do the work you do for? For students, teachers, and community, and why do you do it? So as we think about how we can be in best service to our communities, to our schools, in all the different ways, think about those folks in the system you're working in as we move through the webinar today, and think about how some of this work might be applicable to uplifting the school and the students, the parents, all the people you're working with, the teachers. As I think about designing online conversations, especially ones that we want to go deep and become more courageous and create courageous spaces, I think about designing so that each person can participate as fully as possible. I want us to hold an appreciative approach that faces the issues squarely at the same time as looking for where the movement can go, where can we move in a positive direction. And at the same time, acknowledging up front what's at stake, that there is unequal power in the room, and that there's good intention for making students' lives better. When we think about those as an overall approach and then start using some of the techniques we'll be talking about later, we can really design spaces where full participation is possible. And we can go deeply into being courageous together. So now I want you to remember a time when holding a stakeholder meeting actually pleasantly surprised you. Just hold that thought. You don't have to write anything in the chat at this moment. And as you're remembering that moment, you can write down on your paper, as you think back to a specific meeting that you had, remember all the participants who were there. And for several of them anyway, if not everyone who was at that meeting, write down what their motivations might have been for being in the room. And what did they bring to the table? And what barriers they might have in attending and fully participating in the conversation. And finally, what made it possible for the attendees to show up. Take a minute and write down what seems relevant. And now as people are continuing to work on that, write in the chat one barrier that rises to the top of your list. You see the chat storm coming with all the different from time and fear of change, availability of people to take care of young ones so other people can show up, the complications of the IEP. So all these things, some of them are structural barriers and some of them are language and parity or differential power dynamics that are in the room. All these are things that we can begin to design for. And design starts not at the beginning, not just with the meeting, but in the whole process of invitation, meeting, and follow-up, as you all know in the work that you do. And how do we reestablish trust? So as we design for equity, we'll start with a definition of that. Justice achieved not simply according to the strict letter of the law, but in accordance with the principles of fairness. So it's not simply about making sure everybody has equal access, but making sure that everybody has equal access and the ability to step in. And I always like to bring in a couple other definitions. Our intention, what we intend to do or bring about. So we might intend to have a great meeting that brings everybody in. But the question is actually, what is our impact? We may have great intentions, but who's served by any action, policy, or belief? Who benefits? Who pays? And where does the power sit? And what resources are used and available for people who are stepping into working together? So equity, intention, impact. So despite our best intentions and trying to create a level playing field for conversations to happen in person or online, we often run into the power dynamics that have a real impact on making it hard for conversations to really go deep and be courageous. No matter what our best intentions are, we have a social field that we grew up in and that we are working in that keeps us enmeshed in inequitable relations. And I know that is the work of the technical assistance program and all the work that you're doing in the schools to address disproportionality. But these patterns of power often get in the way of our being truly effective in addressing and creating a playing field that's more level. So there's systemic, institutional, and interpersonal power differentials. And they happen, we're all in different places in our lives and in different relationships. So if I'm a white male and I'm Jewish, happens to be, I have a lot of privilege in relationship to women, to people of color. And to the level of extent that being Jewish is there's a level of anti-Semitism that still exists in the society, I'm in a downside on that relationship. And if you're a person of color and a man and an administrator, you have different power relationships depending on who you're talking with and who you're working with. So power, these patterns of power are relational, especially the power over as an administrator and teacher to your teachers and students and so on, as a parent to your young ones. So when we think about power as being in relationship, there's people who are on the upside. For example, me as a white male has several places in which I'm an upside to women and people of color and so on. And there's a person in the downside of that relationship. So when we look across these lists, these lists are not meant to be that everybody who's in a powerful position has all those characteristics. And there's more in a larger handout that you'll get access to tomorrow in an email. but it's meant to be, this chart's meant to be read horizontally. So in any relationship, for example, between a community member and a institutional member, the institutional member has access to technology, and a person who might be not having internet at home, not having devices that they can easily connect to, they're struggling to make the connection, and so on. So each of these lines are meant to be read horizontally. So I'd like you to think for a moment in your life, in your work, with your LEA. Think of a situation. It could be within the school, or it could be between yourself and somebody in the community you're trying to work with on having courageous conversations. Just think of an actual relationship you have, and think about which of these several patterns might impact that relationship, and just pick one of those patterns for a second. And think of the dynamics that are happening in that relationship. One of these might resonate with you really strongly. And think about how that might impact people showing up in a courageous conversation online. So what can we do to shift these dynamics in virtual meetings? You don't have to type the pattern, but you might want to think about if there's something that came up to you or is coming up to you when you're thinking about interrupting that pattern, what might shift it in an online or virtual meeting? And you can type that in the chat. And these are all good ideas. Yeah, thinking, somebody asked to repeat the question, thinking about those power dynamics that might be in your in-person and virtual meetings, what's an idea that you might have for shifting those dynamics? As people are saying, shared facilitation of meetings, having good process agreements at the beginning of the meeting, taking into account the dynamics, power dynamics that might be showing up in the meeting and thinking about that ahead of time. Well, these are really great thoughts about how we can begin to shift the power relationships and the power dynamics that happen. Yeah, we want to ensure that everybody has a voice so they can be heard. And we want to make sure that people have the opportunity and the encouragement to step in if they feel that without being coerced. You know, many of these ideas that are coming up we'll go into in a little bit in a more formal way, but reminding chatting members that they may be occupying too much airspace, being aware if you're one of those folks. We have a suggestion for a ground rule in many of the meetings that I'm in, which is for those of us who are used to talking a lot / have more privilege, we ask ourselves to step back. And if the space is right, we ask people who are not used to speaking up to step forward. So that's a good shorthand for beginning to address those dynamics. Yeah. And using sticky boards in person is great, and there are tools now, which we'll talk about a little bit at the end of the seminar, similar tools to an online whiteboard, Mural and other tools like that, which are widely available now online, are virtual whiteboards that you can actually use to collaborate with each other. Sorry, my fingers are very slippery today. So, so think about implementing some of those ideas in online meetings. I tend to think of the meeting in this framework. There's a story arc. There's many that you could use, but this is one that's been helpful to me. Grounding and connecting, as we did earlier today. Moving into divergence, emergence, convergence, and then closing. So the grounding and connecting is like why we're here and setting the context. As we started here with a silent reflection on how we are. And then we connected to each other and the larger world. And oftentimes we use icebreakers here. And there's a handout that you'll get with some ideas for virtual icebreakers that I've used pretty successfully. We won't go into that today. So as we move into the divergence phase of a meeting, we're opening the conversation. We're exploring the different dimensions of the problem or the data. We might use tools like story gathering, having with appreciative interviews. And again, you'll have a handout for that. Doing some mapping of the problem, either conceptual mapping or even geographical mapping. Brainstorming, debating, what are the issues? And problem posing, what are the problems and how do we move into solutions? So this can feel chaotic, and if properly managed, that chaos can lead us into the, I shouldn't use the word manage, if we engage with divergence, it can lead to emergent possibilities. So what are we learning? What directions do the data take us? How do we make meaning of what we're being told and what we're by the data and what we're hearing from each other, to really go deeply into understanding the patterns that are emerging. We want to look for what we've missed. So oftentimes the data points to things that we should be investigating further. But more than that is when we put our collective heads together, we might ask the question, what else is there to look for? Are there blind spots that we have due to power dynamics or other reasons that make us not look in the corner for where there's more to be gained? And then using various approaches for creating a vision for the next iteration, whether it's using guided reflection or creative ways, or just having deeper conversation. There's lots of different approaches to look for the vision for the next round. And as we move towards the end of a meeting, we're coming to conversion. You know, where have we come to? Again, that's kind of a meaning-making question as well. We might build models for successful approaches to disproportionality. We might summarize the meeting, not in a mechanical way, but again, to find out what are the high points and what are the most important aspects for us to move forwards with. And then what's left to explore or do. So making plans for follow-up and what needs to happen in the next meeting. In closing, checking the objectives, checking on our feelings in the process, and expressing gratitude. What are we looking forward to, whether that's in our home or in the next meeting or in our community? These are all ways to, parts of a closing of our meeting. So now as we move into tips, there's several tips of these. I'll highlight some of them, and some of them I'll just mention briefly. So we all know about Zoom fatigue. We've all been on our computers way too long for too many hours. But as you know, 2 hours max for a meeting. An hour and a half is better if you can get the work done. And balancing the economies of coming together less frequently versus having shorter meetings that might have more power and impact. It's really helpful, even if you don't have a technical person, to have a co-host. So the facilitator of the meeting is presenting and holding space, perhaps. And the co-host is attending to, like Jen and Susan are helping us here, paying attention to the chat, engaging with the people who are having difficulties, and making sure that the meeting is moving smoothly through the time. So, for example, in this next point, Susan and I have a text channel open to each other, and she's reminding me of things that I need to be reminded of, or if something's going wrong, it's a place for us to talk. Text is good. Tools like Slack or other tools where it can be more of a flow of conversation, those are other possibilities too, but have some kind of back channel so that you're communicating and don't have to use the online chat for that purpose. And as Connie did in the beginning of this meeting, and I know they do at every meeting, orient your participants to the technology. If it's a new group or if somebody is really new to being in online work, maybe have a separate meeting with them a few minutes earlier before the whole meeting gets started to orient participants to the technology. So make sure, these are some ideas that were in the chat already, but make sure that everyone knows who's in the room and what's their role. And as we did in the beginning, trying to create a sense of shared humanity, even though we can't see each other. And a lot of people recently have been talking about safe space, and others have been talking about how we can create a place where people feel safe to step in and contribute their best. Others of us are talking about a brave space, and the distinction I make here is that it may not be possible to feel safe. And so how do we make it possible to take risks with each other? So again, some of the examples in the chat, like stepping forward and stepping back, and other rules that equalize the power. And maybe even allowing people to speak about what their fears or concerns might be ahead of time before the meeting with the facilitator. Obviously, this is especially true for people who are coming in from the community. But how can we create that space where we can take the risks that we need to move forwards? And another one that's often used in organizations is declaring amnesty for the time, that whatever is said in the room stays in the room, both in terms of personal stories being sacred and held in that way, but also that there's not going to be repercussions for people who speak up from a lower position within the organization by their administrators or supervisors. So there's lots of different ways to engage in creating brave space, and it's particular to your organizations and to your meetings. It's thinking about those power dynamics ahead of time and thinking about what's going to make it possible for folks to really step in there and do some problem solving together. So we want to go slow. Time is even slower online than in person, and I'm sure you've seen that. So if you think you can get a certain amount of work done, have it by a third or maybe even a half, and you'll probably be in the right place in terms of your planning. So when you notice that the time calls for a moment of silence, do so. Just give people a chance to reflect on how they're feeling and what is needed for the next moment. And when things get tense, notice that, and don't have to put people on the spot, but notice that the tension is there, and ask if the topic needs to be explored more deeply within the meeting, or is it something that's going to take a longer time and should be handled outside. And make sure that there's, by the end of the meeting, that any of those topics are noted and a plan made for moving forwards with them, even if it's just to say we're going to have a follow-up, individually with somebody outside the meeting. So again, this is also noted in the chat. When you have complicated documents, these i.e. Your plans, I forgot the name of them, but your plans are complicated and they're trying to address complex circumstances, so that's not surprising. But give the documents to people ahead of time and poll them for which points are challenging or controversial, and then focus the conversations on those key points. Now, there's more that you need to do with community members who may not have the time or the confidence to read complicated documents. So if you really want their input, it may be useful to have one member, the other member of the committee, reach out to that person and talk about what's happening in that document and in the meetings, and help them to come to some conclusions for themselves. And in the meeting, balance the engagement of ideas, our shared humanity, and our different histories and positions. So acknowledging that people are coming to their positions from experiences directly with you in the school system, but also from their cultural heritage and the history that they have in coming to the place and being in the place that they're living. And obviously our different positions within the school system, inside or out, and all of those different pieces. So here's a couple of design challenges for creating equity in online space. Oops. Unequal access to technology, time, being freed up to come to meetings that might be during the school day, or which might impact work, or daycare either during the day or in the evening. How do we facilitate for equity? How do we overcome the language barriers? And the low bandwidth, and here I don't mean just like the speed of the internet, but an example of low bandwidth is I can't see your faces right now in this webinar format, so I don't have the two-way communication that I might have if we were seeing each other. But even if we were seeing each other, it's hard to see the subtle changes in posture or facial expressions, or hear the sighs, or the positive comments that are positive sounds that people might make. So there's a lot that we're missing by being in the online channel, and so going slower is one way to address that. But even checking in a little bit more with how people are doing in a meeting might really help to address some of those things. So about language, I haven't used this myself, but I know that Zoom has recently, just stay here for a second. Zoom has just recently created the capability of doing translation in different languages during the meeting. And there's a link that's in one of the handouts that is to the Zoom page that talks about it, but it's accessible to everybody who has a professional account or larger than that, which really can help. It's not perfect, but can help address some of the language barriers. You know that in person, it's always a challenge, and in online space, it's even more of a challenge. So here's some formats, and there is again more listed on the handouts that we have coming to you. But handouts to encourage online thinking and participation. So personal reflection, story sharing. So oftentimes we jump right into the meat of the matter, especially when we feel like we don't have enough time. But at the beginning of a series of meetings, you might take time to ask people to share stories of how they're impacted by disproportionality, for example, on either side of or on any of the sides of the interactions, and just listen to each other's stories. And you can mine those stories to make to understand more about what's happening in your community. So using dyads and triads on the topic, Zoom has a great breakout capacity, as do many of the other platforms, so that you can break down by topic or randomly have people talk in small groups. I mean, talk about the topic, but you can either manually assign people to rooms based on various criteria, or you can have random assignment within Zoom. So you can use the dyads and triads and even larger groups to really hone in on problem solving when you're coming up with data that you need to analyze or controversial topics. So that gives more of a chance of participation. And then creative use of online and shared documents. We're using the chat in some way like that, but there's also the possibility to set up a Google Doc or a Google Slide where different breakout groups can enter the conclusions that they're coming to, and so it can become a shared document at the end of the meeting. You can also use the online documents as a way to do things asynchronously. So some people are deep thinkers and they don't talk a lot, but they have a lot to contribute. So if you give people a chance to use online documents to make their contributions, or to use an online messaging set tool like Slack or other ones where you can have threaded messages, those are good ways to encourage engagement between meetings and to really allow for deep thinking about the problems that you're facing without having enough time to actually fully process them within meetings. So creative use of synchronous and asynchronous ways to connect is really a great way to design your data analysis and your plan evaluations. So as we said in the beginning, a great meeting starts before we even get in the door. And so we want to make sure that not only are the right people in the room, but that the invitation is inviting, is opening the door for people who might not feel welcomed in institutional spaces, for example. So how do we make sure that people are in the right place at the right time? How do we make sure that people are invited in a good way? So obviously the first one is to identify who should be in the room at a minimum. And secondly, we want to reach out to our networks and beyond those networks. And we have some ideas for that in the next couple of slides. And emails are great, but personal invitation is really important. So address it to a specific person and maybe follow up with a phone call. Do all the things that you know how to do in engaging people who are outside your institution. And of course, the serendipitous public invite is also really useful to find the outliers who you might not know who they are. So who are other networks that you could reach out to make sure that people are able to come who should be there? So there's churches, advisory committees, the CAC. I won't read through all of them. Native American resources, social work programs, your advisory committees of all kinds, and the PTA and the Parent Student Association as well. So there's many, many, many possibilities for reaching out to find out other folks who can be really enriching the evaluation process that you're going through. So, as I said, we're going to be moving through a role play, and we have 4 people who are going to participate with us. And I'd like to ask those folks to get to unmute yourself and start your video camera. We have 4 people who are panelists, if you will, but they'll be role playing for us. So if you could do that, there you are. Hi, everybody. Welcome to the space. And we've arranged a little bit of a, why don't you say your voices? Let's make sure all the mics are working.
Maureen here.
Kathy.
Mary.
And Mary, hi. Welcome. And they'll be playing the roles of administrator. Raise your hand, Maureen. And teacher. Who's the teacher in this? Is that you, Connie, I think?
No, it's Kathy.
Kathy is being the teacher. Sorry, Kathy.
That's okay.
Parent and advocate. And we know that there's many more people who will be in a stakeholder meeting and having different roles. But for the sake of this role play, it seemed like this is the core. So here's the scenario. So Maureen, do you want to take it from here as the administrator and host? Yeah.
Okay, sure, thank you. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for coming to this Zoom meeting for us to begin this discussion for our school district to begin to address this issue that we've just had identified for us of disproportionality. As you know, from our invitation to you, we really wanted to have at least an initial meeting with just a few of you so that we could get started on a process that would help us figure out what a root cause of this disproportionality is. So just briefly, because really I want to start with you and introductions of each of you. Our issue is that we have been over-identifying students, Latinx students in particular, as having a disability of a specific learning disability. And so our job is to try to determine why. What is the root cause for us in this district to be there? And so each of you have been chosen because of your wonderful and unique perspectives that you could bring to this conversation so we can try to figure this out. So I'm Maureen Burness. I'm a relatively new administrator to this school district. And I, again, would like to welcome you. I'm happy that you're here. Would one of you like to introduce yourself next, or how begin that?
Hi, I'm Kathy Johnson. I'm a general education 7th grade English teacher.
Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
And then we have Dr. Bacon and Ms. Silva. Would one of you like to introduce yourself and your role as well?
Excuse me, do you have a translator for her?
Oh, how could I have forgotten that? I am so sorry, but this is the meeting to try to plan what to do. And I understood, Ms. Silva, that your English was enough for being able to have a good conversation. Was I wrong?
I understand what you're saying. I don't know if I can say what I'm saying so that you would understand.
Oh, luckily I have some Spanish, and so maybe together we can figure out what to do. And I've just learned about an option through Zoom where we can actually get a translator, and that might help us too. What I'd love from you is your name and your role and what you can tell us about you and your child in this school as a representative of Latinx students. Does that help?
Okay. I'm a mother. I have 2 children in this school, a 5th grader and a 7th grader. And my 5th grader is special ed.
Great. Well, thank you for being here. We'll try harder to make sure we can truly get your input throughout this process, not just today. And Dr. Bacon, can you introduce yourself for us, please?
Yes, I'm just a friend of the family, but I'm an administrator in another school district, and I often serve as an advocate for families who may need to have someone who provides some liaison between the school and the home. And so, although I think Mrs. Silva does, speak in English and understand some English, there's some of the things even in so far in the conversation, when you talk about role groups and disproportionality that may be beyond her. And I want to make sure that she can be an active participant in this meeting, given that there is no one available to translate.
Well, thank you, Dr. Bacon. I trust you will be a great resource for us then, and we will do better, and that's something that we can plan for our next meetings. So again, thank you to all of you for being here. Muchas gracias, Senora Silva. So our job is to begin to plan for how we can figure out why we have so many students who are identified as having a specific learning disability, more than you would expect for our numbers in this district. And so that's what I was looking for, is kind of the initial perspectives that each of you might be able to bring to this conversation. So do you have reasons? So particularly, Ms. Silva, what I'm asking is, do you have ideas or thoughts about either your daughters or students like your children who are having trouble with schools that maybe we could do differently?
Could I make a pause for a second?
Yeah.
Sure.
So I forgot to suggest that people type in chat if they notice anything in the conversation that they might choose to improve, and just type in the chat as going along, either from your own perspective or some of the things we talked about in this. And Mary, some people are having a little hard time hearing you. So is there a way that you can speak closer to the mic or something like that?
I can
Thanks.
try.
Okay, it may not work, and that's the way it is, but thanks. So, and I won't interrupt too many times, but I might step in a few minutes as well. So go ahead, Connie.
Thank you. My students have very good teachers, and my daughter's teacher said she was having problems, and so special ed would help. And so I don't know. It's been, I think it's helpful. My daughter is doing better, but I just I trust the teachers. They know what they're doing, right?
Well, thank you very much. Our job will be to find out if your trust is well placed or if we need to do something more or different.
Well, I have some concern about our focusing first on Mrs. Silva. She can only talk about her own child. I'd like to ask the teachers and the administrators, what do you think the problem is? Because we're not just talking about one child. We're talking about the fact that this district has a pattern of not serving these young people well.
Well, if I can address that, looking at the problem you presented at the beginning of the meeting, and at the risk of not being popular, I just want to say that I think one of the systemic issues is the assessment process. A lot of the students are given standardized tests in a language they don't understand regardless, and those scores are used as a referral for special education. So I think we really lack a process for standardized testing. Even though we have some systems like the CELT, they're still not normed on the population and the language of our students. And I think this is really causing a lot of referrals and a lot of confusion, because yes, the students appear to be 2 to 3 years below grade level when they're tested, but is special ed the answer? I think we're kind of missing the boat on the language.
Oh my goodness, I think I heard two really important things that we need to get documented. I wish we were in a room where we could put these up on the wall so we don't lose them. But one clearly is we need to look at the assessment process and get more information about that. But then also we need to look at what are we doing for students in the classroom before special ed?
Well, what
And
are we doing?
Well, and I just don't think there are enough authentic resources for teachers. I'm going to speak for teachers. There's no time, number one, to really differentiate in the classroom when you have 60 students coming through 3 or 4 times a day. And there just aren't authentic tools to use for the students. We're really lacking in that.
Mrs. Silva,
Right.
do you understand what it means when the school district says that your child has a disability, and they said that it comes from an assessment process that even that they're admitting may be flawed? Do you understand what that means?
I had a meeting, and they had teachers that were there, and I know one teacher, my daughter was doing very well in that class, but in another one she wasn't, and so the teachers, the group, the principal and everyone decided this is what was best for her. So I don't really know what tests they did, but I know the teachers were there to tell me what wasn't working. So,
But do you know what learning disabled means? What having a disability means?
but my understanding is she needed more help from different teachers, from the special ed teachers, to learn better. That.
So it sounds like we need to do a better job of explaining the process and not just offering you help, but helping make sure that all parents understand exactly what and why. But we have to be right about that too. So that's what I'm hearing from Ms. Johnson is our process better be right so that we can.
I hate to be the naysayer at this meeting, but I really think it's important to understand, as today is kind of a demonstration, we don't have translators at the IEP meetings that are knowledgeable enough, if we even get a translator, that are knowledgeable enough to translate the information, especially the serious information the psychologist is presenting to a parent. So that's a problem. And you can see that our parent was just taking the advice of the teacher, but I'm not quite sure she understood. If you don't have somebody that really understands that technical piece and translate it correctly, you might not be making the right decisions.
Right. And this certainly sounds like a huge issue in this district, and we will need to look at that and begin to address it. So I'm going to add that to our list here on my wall at home, and we'll add that. And thank you for your honesty and openness about that, Ms. Johnson. We do need to get everything on the table so that we can figure out what to do about it. But we need to make sure we're clear about the cause. And Dr. Bacon, I feel like you had some other suggestions for us as well.
I really just, since Ms. Silva, it's really a challenge for her to have to come here. And I really think that it's important that you were willing to do it. But I guess I wanted to get a sense about, Mrs. Silva, how much involvement did you have with the people who were testing your child and who were writing the reports and whatever, before you actually went to the meeting where the people shared with you that they felt that she needed support? How much involvement did you have with that process?
Before the meeting?
Before the meeting?
No, not very much. A teacher called me to say my daughter wasn't finishing all of her homework. So I knew there was a problem, and school is very important to me and my husband. So when they said it's time for a meeting, of course, I took off work to be there. Yeah.
Well, thank you again for all that. But I do agree, we do need to get better about explaining things and making sure we have information. I'd like us to put the whole assessment process from the referral through actually the tools that we use on this list based on what you all have said so far. And this is just the beginning, really, of what we need to do to look at all of the potential reasons. I'm concerned that if this happened to Ms. Silva, perhaps this is happening to more families. And I think we need to be sure that we're using the right resources at every one of our schools. So figuring out what those resources are and what's missing will be part of a search for a root cause here.
Well, I'm glad we're doing this because very frankly, I'm very surprised by the responses from the administrator and the teacher in this meeting, since I've been in a number of other meetings. And oftentimes the blame is placed on the family, on language, and not necessarily on what it is that you're doing or not doing that fits the needs of these children. And I'm not sure that this meeting has not been an unusual one, at least as from my experience.
So if I can be, accept a challenge from you about this, it sounds like we have issues maybe of lack of cultural understanding on the parts of many of our teachers. Is that really what you're telling me?
Well, I think that that's an issue, but I also think that you have a population, even as represented by some of the comments that Mrs. Silva made, that's willing to accept what educators say. And so if you have parents who are not questioning, who feel as if people are doing what is best for them, then it's very, very important that you have people who understand that there are problems in the system, because these are people who are going to accept what you say. And so what you say has to be accurate.
Well, and unfortunately, we have a lot of brand new teachers in the district, and they don't feel confident enough to buck the system. I'm just going to be honest with you. They feel like they have to go along with whatever the program is, and it's really hard for them to speak up, even though they know that student has a language issue and it truly isn't a disability, but they're going to go right along with the group. That's kind of a dynamic that needs to be worked on.
Mm-hmm. Well, we have to figure out a way then to help, because we need our teachers to be understanding and empathetic and work with families appropriately, not take advantage. I think I hear you saying, Dr. Bacon, that it's not like we can just tell people what to do without appropriate rationale.
So I'd like to step in for a second. Thank you we'll continue on with the role play in a minute. There's a lot of great observations happening in the chat, and we'll do a review later. But let's say that we opened the meeting and we are in the divergent phase now, finding out all the different problems. But right then, there was an emergence of a possibility of moving forwards, right? We're beginning to move into emergence. So if Maureen, as the facilitator of the meeting, think about that for a second, right? And again, this is totally unscripted. We're just rolling with things. So it's not like you had a chance to plan, but think about how you could take that cue and move it into a possibility generation, if you will. Does that make sense?
Sure.
Go for it.
Yeah, I want to reiterate that we were super concerned about how the time frame here is so tight, but so
we've got a little time, but
yeah. So back to our meeting. I want to thank you three again for all of your different inputs here. I think we have an awful lot of ideas for us to begin a process of figuring out where we go from here, and really what we need to get to is the root cause, or the reasons, the rationale. I want to make sure, Ms. Silva, that you're understanding what I'm saying at this point, because this isn't a normal school process. But what we're looking for are reasons for why we have so many students identified as disabled when maybe they're not. Because what I'm hearing from our teacher is that it might be staff and our assessment process that are contributing to an over-identification because we're not doing what we need to do. Does that feel like a place we could begin to further explore, or what are your ideas about where we could go from here?
Whose ideas? The parent?
All of you.
Oh,
I'm not sure Miss Silva understands. I've got to be honest with you. I'm feeling a little discomfort there.
Mm-hmm. Ms. Silva, how do you feel about that? I don't want to put you on the spot. I don't want to have this be uncomfortable. I want it to be an invitation to you to give us your thoughts and feelings about what we could do differently.
You're talking about reasons for disability. Are you talking about my daughter?
And any Hispanic student in this district, because we have so many identified. But yes, we know you know your daughter best.
So are other parents having this meeting?
Other parents can be invited to the process. You were chosen because your teacher recommended you as a parent who could help us.
Oh, I thought I was in trouble, or my daughter, or I'm sorry.
Oh,
Okay, okay,
oh,
that helps.
well, that makes me feel very sad. We don't want you to feel badly. We want to have you feel invited.
well, I think although Mrs. Silva may feel invited, I think that for a lot of parents who don't understand the process and don't necessarily understand what defining the student is having, their child is having a disability means, they feel it's only their problem. And the fact that we're sitting around the table means that this problem goes beyond a single parent who has to feel bad about maybe my child is a problem. But once you give them a sense that there are a lot of other students who are experiencing the same thing, what we hope is we direct them to look at what the system is doing. I mean, what we're talking about is a parent who says the first time that they knew anything in the assessment process and the first time there was any real contact with her was when she showed up at a meeting. So part of what we're talking about is how much did the system look at what this child's strengths were from her perspective. That's why I was moving toward Mrs. Connie, asking you to share, what do you think your daughter's strengths are that might be missing? How bright do you think she is? Do you really think there's something wrong based on your observation of her in the family that she doesn't understand, she cannot do? And what did it feel like when the school told you that there was something wrong? So my feeling is I wish that we could, as we have more parents involved here, give them more of an opportunity to talk about what their child's strengths are that they feel that the school may be missing.
Well, we have a lot of work to do in terms of setting up a better meeting with understandable options for parents. That's obvious in this meeting. And I'm feeling like there's a couple of different next steps we need to be thinking about. One of which is making sure that Ms. Silva can understand and get and participate everything that we need that would be of help to her and her daughter and other students. And so we are clearly not doing well by that. But we also have other work to do, which is to figure out exactly what those details are. And Kathy, I think you've done a good job of starting us down a road of where we could take a lot of those questions. So then we need to think about what our next steps would be. I know we only had very little time to talk today. So even if we could just figure out what do we need to do next, I think that would be a good process for today. And that could be individual meetings, other conversations. We could have a meeting for parents with a translator that would invite as much of the community as possible. I think there's a lot of different ideas. And so I'd like to invite your ideas to what you would see us doing as our next step so that we can make a plan and several agendas.
So let's call it at this point. Is that all right?
Sure.
And just do a little reflection. And so thanks, panelists. That was great. And it's generated a lot of interesting conversation here on the side you'll get a chance to look at later. Why don't you just take a moment and just notice how you are feeling and how you, it's kind of hard to do this, right? Because you're a human, but how you were feeling in your roles while you were talking, right? You can use your own feelings, right? Does that make sense? Use your imagination for a second. And just in a couple words, speak to that, and then we can do a little bit of a debrief of what was going on there and what you saw, and then I'll bring in a few points. And again, there's a lot of really juicy stuff in the chat that we can look at later. So
You want to go to
Mary,
which order?
yeah, go for it. Whoever wants to speak first.
Well, I feel very comfortable typically being an advocate and challenging the system, but I felt uncomfortable in the role because I couldn't even, I had two people who were from the school who were willing to throw the school district under the bus before I so I wasn't, but simultaneously, I also felt that I had to protect this parent from them, this parent who was very willing, and I'm sure you're doing the right thing, as they keep saying we're not, and it's not me, it's those new inexperienced teachers. But I also felt like the protection and my would have to come after this meeting, because when she said, you mean there are other kids who have meetings like this? On one level, you have some parents who trust the system, but you also have a forum where her trust was going to be challenged.
Yeah.
And so I felt some ambivalence about taking on the school people as I would like to, because on one level it would expose this parent to understanding that maybe she shouldn't trust. I don't know.
Thank you.
Yeah, I can say, I mean, just very briefly, I felt very on the spot. So yeah, it was just,
Great.
I kept reflecting on, wow, I wish teachers really felt they could share what they really thought, because I've heard the conversations. That's what I was reflecting on. But when you're in a teaching position and you're facing the district administrators, it would be very difficult to share what you really thought about assessment and what you really thought about the referral process. So it's tough.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I guess I should add, I felt very supported. Like, it was very clear that Maureen, Kathy, Mary were all there to help me. There wasn't any antagonism or lack of trying to understand my perspective. I still felt on the spot.
Yep.
Well, people were asking you to almost give solutions.
Yeah.
Right.
To even a problem that you weren't even sure you understood.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So that's we can really go deep into like dissecting all of the pieces of this. What you were speaking to, Mary, I would assign to the role of tokenism, as it were, that Connie's role was, you know, representative of all X, Y, or Z's, which isn't the case in a bigger meeting. But it's true dynamically, right? That whoever shows up are still going to be under that spotlight, if you will, and used as the tokens for representing all of the parents and from the kids. So how do we address that? How do we shift it? So it's like we're solving this problem together, and your perspective is valuable, rather than tell us what your problems are, Connie, you know, and putting her on the spot as a example of something that we can now look at, you know,
Well,
and
and
you
I
were saying
think
in a better way.
to me,
Yeah.
one of the biggest issues, and I felt super uncomfortable about this because it didn't feel like me, but also that the conflict that administrators have in this job is that we have tasks to get done,
Right.
and limited and very compacted time now to do it in. And so part of what I was trying to show was how difficult it is to get through all of that, but that maybe that ends up not being as productive because you can't just get through it. You have to go through the steps.
Totally. I just wanted to point out a couple other things that might help in the design. So if in the beginning, and again, this is like a microcosm of a much longer process where you would get to know each other better and so on. But if in the beginning, again, Maureen, thank you for stepping up. And even the choice of language, like what are your roles? That's a power thing that happens, right? Because the administrators and it's like, who's here and what do they do is a different way than saying, or different languaging than things like that. There's some subtle ways in the introduction and in the invitation that we can make it so it's more of an equal playing field. And again, it's just something to think about because it's our unconscious. When we step into the administrator position, we assume everybody thinks and speaks the way that we do and so on. So just a thought. And the interpretation, there was a really good comment by Julie that you'll see about how to work with Zoom and getting interpreters, and you can look at that some more. There might be ways if I was a person who English wasn't my first language, if somebody said, is your English good enough? Or can you understand well enough? I can't remember exact words that were used to talk to Connie, but it might be, is there a way that we can make this a better place for all of us to communicate or something like that? So that we're not like picking on the person whose language is challenged. I don't want to be liberal about it. It's
not her
good to address
problem,
that,
it's our problem.
Yeah, exactly. So like, how do we all listen together, right? Is more the issue. And she said, I can hear you. Go ahead, Mary.
Yeah, the issue isn't just language. Sometimes part of it, having someone there who speaks Spanish, we call them the translators. It's much more the question of having a support system sitting next to you where we're talking about the bicultural nature of this process.
Exactly.
So all the other people were on the other side, and she's there by herself.
Yeah.
And even if she speaks English, it's not the same. And
Totally.
I've always said to parents, whether they are primary English language or not, bring an advocate with you to that meeting, because oftentimes what happens is you can't hear the same things, and sometimes you're emotionally involved in. And so it's important for that discussion afterwards, what happened, to you, for the person to have had someone there.
Right.
Who was supportive of them, irrespective of the language issue.
So does anybody else have anything they want to reflect on as we're moving forwards? I have a couple of final things to say about it, and then we'll move back to closing down the meeting. So I think it's really, again, this was a free-flowing conversation and an improv. And if you were to have planned this meeting more, you would have really thought about like what's a synthesis point? How do we begin to bring it together? And Maureen, you really you did your best to do that in the circumstances, and I really appreciate it. But the thing I'm getting at is, how do we take those, sharpen those problems when we're hearing them, and then say, oh, here's an opportunity for us to work together. And you did do some of that for sure, just to encourage more of that in our meetings, right? So here's a problem, not like immediately go to solution, but here's an opportunity for us to work together. And you did that really well in several places. At one point you mentioned, oh, I wish I had a blackboard
Yep.
or a whiteboard to put our sticky notes up on. And again, online, there are lots of tools. Some of them are free and some of them are not, that you can actually create sticky notes and have all your participants move them around and do all that. And there's a whole, it's really a fun way to do things. So Mural, Miro are two different platforms. Stormboard and a bunch of the other platforms have tools for doing that. Even Zoom does under the share, but it's very clumsy using share screen for that. So I encourage you, if you are going to be doing online work for a long time with and want to encourage that kind of participation, you can really use those tools to great advantage, and they're not super expensive. Well, don't know institutional prices honestly, but but they can really amplify the ability of people to work together in teams, and everybody can contribute. It takes a little bit of extra time in the beginning to get people oriented to the space, right? So make sure you have, a half an hour ahead of time to really play with the tool if you're going to use it. So the frustration level might be high. And yeah, just a round of applause, finger snapping or whatever silently from everybody for our panelists. Thanks so much for playing. And yeah, when you get to read the chat, you'll see you brought up a lot for people. So thanks.
Great.
So, again, we were moving through a lot of material pretty quickly, but we were aiming to examine issues of power in online spaces, what the challenges are and what the dynamics are, and how do we begin to address them in our meeting design and our thinking about our meetings ahead of time. We were exploring ways to design these meetings. We used some examples and your own reflections to think about how we can address these issues for more equity and more creative engagement on the part of everybody. And we shared a bunch of facilitation and outreach tips, both things that I presented and also things that people put in the chat. And in the role play, there was a lot of richness there, both in terms of how people are constrained by their roles and what are the possibilities to begin to, as people, as administrators and teachers and advocates, to really help move the conversation into a way that the folks in the community can really participate. There are things that we didn't address about, I was thinking about what Kathy was talking about as a teacher feeling potentially scared to speak because her administrators are in the room and she doesn't know what the consequences might be of her speaking. So she has to be judicious, let's say, in how she speaks. So as we think about designing these meetings and processes, making it really clear to the teacher that they're welcomed and doing what you can as an administrator or lead teacher perhaps, in making sure that the people with less structural power are really, as I said before, maybe guaranteed amnesty. It's hard to build trust up sometimes in a short time. So having those conversations ahead of time, saying we really want your input. We're gonna not, this is not a part of your job evaluation, or however you would say it, to make sure that people who are in those kinds of positions, or teaching assistants especially, might really be willing to speak their minds. So how do you do that? Each of you will have to sort that out in your own meetings. But there are important considerations, the invitation not just to the community members, but to the people who are in in your schools, in your LEAs, so that you can really have the most fruitful meetings. So I'm available to have brief conversations with about how your plans are developing for having these online conversations. I'm happy to offer some support, both by email or by longer conversations if you want. You can contact me at wall@toolsforchange.org, and all that information is on the handouts as well. And really, thanks so much for letting me share some of this information and perspectives with you. I know that it can be really challenging to think about how to go from the in-person meeting to the online meeting, especially when it's potentially really tense. And how do we think about things in a way that creates the possibility of courageous conversations? So I encourage you to reach out to me and have fun with all these ideas and tips. And thanks again to Connie and Susan for all their support in making this happen. And I'd like to pass it back to you, Connie.
Great. Thank you so much, Bill, for this webinar and all of the information that you provided. And yes, there are lots of additional resources that will be shared. You see the links on that last slide, but we'll also be sharing them via email following the webinar. So just wanted to let people know with a quick evaluation, as we typically do. Thank you everyone who was here and participated in this webinar, and of course to our small little role-playing group. Really appreciate our partners being willing to put themselves in those positions for us so that we could all learn from this. Just a quick, and you can see on the slide, we have a couple more webinars coming to you in June. On June 16th at the same time, 12 noon, we have Unpacking and Addressing Hispanic Disproportionality. So you'll be hearing from two of our experts in California who are also TA facilitators presenting at that webinar. And then on June 30th, at the same hour, our last webinar for this fiscal year, the 8 R's of Trauma Responsive Mindset and Approach to Educating in Our New Normal. Another one that's very on topic given our current circumstances today. So we hope that you're able to join us for both of those. And again, if you haven't registered, please be sure to do that. And remember that, as always, they will be archived so they can be there for resources for you in the future as well. So everyone, please enjoy the rest of your day. And again, Bill, thank you so much. We really appreciate you being here with us today. And with all that.